Hi, this is Erik again. In this episode, I'm going to answer the second question about why I can't use I think when you ask for my opinion in academic writing. So, this is the second question that we usually have when we receive comments from teachers. The key lies in the second adjective, as with what we talked about technical, impersonal, and formal English. So that is, in this part, I'm going to talk about what it means to be impersonal. Okay, so let's come back to this passage again. And it'll be good that if I read it out for you again. So here it goes. So same-sex marriage becomes much more popular than before. More countries have already legalized same-sex marriage in these few years. Nowadays, 21 countries have legalized gay marriage nationally. Hong Kong is not just an international city, but also a pluralistic city full of different cultures. According to Article 32 of Basic Law in Hong Kong, residents are allowed to have the freedom of religious beliefs, do missionary work, and take part in the religious activities publicly. It is charitable to have a city full of different religions, and citizens still respect each other. It shows that Hong Kong is full of social inclusion. Therefore, some people think that Hong Kong will legalize same-sex marriage. However, I do not agree with it, since it will harm our society and tradition. The following gives evidence of keeping gay marriage illegal. Again, just a little disclaimer. I do not hold any particular view for or against same-sex marriage, but it's just what the student wrote in his or her paper. So this passage, as we showed you in the previous video, in the previous episode, in terms of technicality, it lacks some sort of organization as well as technical ideas, including the professional content regarding same-sex marriage, as well as the logical flow. After asking my students about what they feel about this passage, they have mixed feelings and they have some reflections on the passage as well. So most of the students reflected that the writer in the essay showed somewhat of clear stance, and in terms of voice or voices, the writer used citations and the credible external sources to support his or her viewpoints. Meanwhile, one of the students was very clear that the writer is a little bit too self-opinionated. So that means the writer is somehow full of himself or herself. But how did I look at it? Okay, so I will show you how I looked at it in terms of subjectivity, in terms of evaluation, in terms of voice. So how did the student perform? So my feedback was the writer gave some subjective opinion towards the topic, and he or she was overly assertive, and in the writing there is also some unnecessary authorial presence, and the external voices used was somehow vague. Of course, I'm not saying the citations are vague, but there are certain expressions in terms of language that are vague in the writing. Okay, so I'm going to show you in detail. Okay, so here it is, the passage again, and I will highlight the part when the writer starts giving his or her opinion. which is the second half of the introduction. Okay, so I have highlighted a few phrases and words in this part, including the adjective cherishable, the verb shows, the noun inclusion, the phrase some people think, and the modal verbs will, and the phrase I do not agree and will harm our society. So by highlighting these phrases and words, you might already know what I'm going to talk about regarding the writer being subjective. Okay, so here comes the first idea about subjective opinion. So the first aspect would be subjective opinion. Okay, so in the second part, at the beginning of the second part of the paragraph, we have the adjective cherishable. So it somehow denotes a positive value towards the topic. Okay, so this adjective points to the noun city full of different religions. Okay, so it sounds like a comment from the writer. But now we would need to consider whether this value, this positive value denoted in this adjective, is representative of the whole population, including the readers, or it's just from the writer himself or herself. Okay, in this case, I will simply delete this comment. Okay, because the introductory paragraph may not be a good place to express one's opinion straight away. Okay, so, and the second point, as we move down to the end of the paragraph, we can see the verb harm, okay, regarding the harmful effects, as the writer suggests, of legalizing same-sex marriage to the society and tradition. Okay, but it somehow contradicts the positive value regarding Hong Kong as a city of different religions, having different religions, and embracing social inclusion. Okay, so the writer's opinion seeming to me is not in line with what has been established in the earlier part of the paragraph. Although, of course, we have the transition marker, however, showing the turn of the stance, okay, towards the writer's opinion. But at the same time, you can see this shift in stance is not quite strong in this case because of a few reasons. So I'm going to show you in the next slide and explain why. So one reason about the writer's stance being weaker than expected, although it is not wrong to have one's opinion in his or her own writing, but in this sense, in academic writing, we usually do not put I with the verb, thinking verbs like agree, think, and so on. Okay. Also, because academic writing usually focuses on the knowledge about the topic or the arguments arising from the topic, if you put I at the beginning of a sentence, it seems that you are more important than the arguments. Okay, so it seems to highlight the writer's personal reflection rather than focusing on the topic itself. And the next one, our, okay, it's a very common issue students would make in their writing. When you say our, okay, who do you mean? Who are included? Okay, so this essay talks about the Hong Kong society, but if, only the imaginary if someone else out of Hong Kong, and say, I'm reading this and I can see our society, do you just mean the Hong Kong society, or do you also mean all the societies in the world? So when we use what we call the inclusive we have to be very careful. Okay? And if I were the writer, I would simply delete our. And perhaps the kind of subjective opinion regarding harming the society and tradition through legalizing same-sex marriage is already quite weak and needs a lot of refinement. Okay, but let's fix these two. The first problem first. How do we change the expression "I do not agree"? Right, so at the top, we have the original sentence, I do not agree with it. So what is problematic, if you allow me to go into the details? First of all, if you still remember the subject, verb, object, that kind of sentence construction, what is usually important, or the topic of your message, will be put in the subject position. In this case, I is not the topic of the essay, and I would say it should not be in the subject position. Okay? So, and what is backgrounded is exactly the topic, okay, of this essay. Especially when the writer talks about, I do not agree with it. The it, the pronoun, represents legalizing same-sex marriage, the topic which should be foregrounded. Okay? And how can we do it? I'm going to show you in the next slide, but let's finish this slide with the verb. What's problematic with the verb agree, okay, is that when it is used with I, the personal I, it is a subjective use of the emotive verb, because agree refers to what people think in their minds, right? Positive or negative. If you say you do not agree, of course, the emotion would be negative. In this case, if you say you do not agree or I do not agree with something, it means the opinion only belongs to you, and it may not be applicable to the other cases or the other readers. Okay, so this argument or this stance is actually weak, although it is very clear. Okay, the way that we can fix this would be very simple. If you pay attention to the pronoun it, you may see that it is exactly the topic based on what we have already established in the previous sentences of the paragraph. So it would be legalizing same-sex marriage, exactly the topic of the essay. So why don't we put this it in the subject position and make this specific, what the pronoun it means? So in my case, my revision would be putting legalization of same-sex marriage in the subject position. Okay? And this long noun phrase in the subject position not only highlights the topic of the essay, but also highlights it as a technical one. Okay? Remember what we talked about, the process of nominalization in our previous video. Okay? So it's a process of turning something like a verb, like actions, into things, into events, into ideas in the form of nouns. Okay? And then, if you read on, legalization of same-sex marriage should not be promoted. And this is already representing the writer's idea and argument. Okay, should or should not be promoted. The modal verb should has covered the writer's stance, but not in a very explicit way, because there is no I, and there is no I do not agree, or we don't have I think in this sentence. So remember, if you say, I think legalization of same-sex marriage should not be promoted, I may recommend that you delete I think at the beginning of the sentence and let the topic stands out in the sentence. Okay, so let's move on to the next point. Okay, and I'm sure some of you have already identified this problem. Towards the end of the paragraph, the writer wrote, some people think that Hong Kong should legalize same-sex marriage. So the writer is not being very careful in two senses. So the first one, who are the some people here? Okay, any evidence you can suggest more clearly. And then look at the verb think. So some people think, but why is it important to consider what they think? Yeah? So unless they are someone important and you can find them out and suggest so, it is very vague and weak to say some people think. So let me give you more details about this phrase and how we can improve it. Okay, in this case, when the writer does not know who some people are, simply don't use it. Okay, so this subject is not necessary at all. And the second point is the sentence structure subject plus think plus or believe plus an extra clause. Like some people think that Hong Kong will legalize same-sex marriage. The structure actually suggests a less certain tone. So you might simply say may or might. Yeah? So it has the same or similar effect to the modal verbs may or might. So how are we gonna revise this? You may say it is possible that Hong Kong will legalize same-sex marriage. So it is plus adjectives is a common expression to suggest possibility, certainty, or simply giving a comment on the particular topic that goes after that, the word that. Okay? And to keep things even simpler, you may say Hong Kong may legalize same-sex marriage. You simply delete some people think and replace this phrase with the modal verb may. Moving on, the writer is also considered as overly assertive. Okay, in a few cases, so I highlight two. Okay, the first one is the use of verb show. So show is a suitable verb to use only when something is evident. Okay, as far as we know, Hong Kong still does not have a roadmap to towards recognizing same-sex marriage. So, and if you remember the passage before this sentence, the writer talks about freedom of religion. So how is it logically related to this conclusion, saying that Hong Kong is full of social inclusion? So we are not sure. Okay, and does freedom of religion anyway entail social inclusion? So as a writer yourselves, you have to pay close attention to the logical linkage between two sentences or two parts of a passage, let's say, and that will affect how you are choosing the correct verbs. Perhaps you may say it suggests that Hong Kong is full of social inclusion. Okay, but in this case, when the two sentences or two meanings in a paragraph do not match or are not aligned with one another, it doesn't even matter whether it is suitable to use show or implies or suggest. So work the logic right, work it out, before you choose your language. Okay, and the second issue would be the use of modal verbs that denotes high possibility. So will, in addition to denoting future, it also represents something having a high possibility. Okay, or it is possible for something to happen. But in these two cases, how so? Okay, again, we don't know when Hong Kong is going to recognize same-sex marriage or even legalizing it. So will doesn't seem to be a very appropriate modal verb to use. And because of the weak arguments or thesis inside this introductory paragraph, when the writer says he or she does not agree with legalizing same-sex marriage, the reason that doing this or legalizing same-sex marriage will harm our society and tradition will be even weaker. Okay? How do you know it will harm the society? And it goes against the original argument that you have established all the way before, however. Okay? You said that Hong Kong is a pluralistic city and people are socially inclusive, everyone embraces different people, different religion, etc., etc. So it seems to be too hasty to say legalizing same-sex marriage will harm the society and tradition. So there are a few things that you have to fix in this case when you are writing your first paragraph's essay or when you are commenting on the topic. So there are a few things you need to pay attention to. Okay, so let's go back to the modal passage and see how the modal passage serves to give a more impersonal or a little bit more distance evaluation. So let's have a look. Again, let me read it out very quickly for you. So same-sex marriage has become increasingly popular in recent years, with 21 countries having recognized same-sex marriage. Meanwhile, Asian countries and regions such as Hong Kong are still in heated debates over this issue. As a pluralistic city with different cultures, Hong Kong is expected to embrace diversity of race, religion, sexual orientation, etc. In addition, there's a growing number of local organizations that advocate equal rights of the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender community. According to Ricky Chukenman, a chairman of Equal Opportunities Commission, the commission seeks to insert initiatives protecting LGBT individuals from discrimination, while preferring a step-by-step approach instead of urging the government to recognize same-sex marriage. In a similar vein, although an anti-discrimination initiatives should be promoted, legalizing same-sex marriage may be against the will of the more conservative communities in Hong Kong. In light of this essay will illustrate the arguments against the legislation of same-sex marriage in Hong Kong from the perspectives of religion, tradition, and society as a whole. So just like what I have done previously, I will focus on the later part of this passage. So you can see I highlighted a few phrases, including should be, maybe against, the more conservative communities, this essay, arguments against. So let's take a look at them one by one. Right. In the first place, the writer has adjusted his or her assertiveness. Okay. So the first use of modal verb should suggests high modality, but not exactly categorical or 100% certain in this case. It only suggests a higher modality because the initiatives, the anti-discrimination initiatives, are seen as appropriate ethically. So something that Hong Kong people or readers in general would agree mutually, okay? Because no one should discriminate other people different from him or her, right? So this is the first use. But then in the second use of modal verbs, the writer lowers the modality or the possibility because the writer is not sure whether his or her opinion represents the concerned parties. And in this case, against the will of the more conservative communities in Hong Kong, but he is not sure whether all the conservative communities here in Hong Kong would not agree with this argument or with this idea. So the writer is being very careful here, suggesting that he's not sure, simply meaning he's not 100% sure. So this is a very important strategy when you are expressing your opinions or expressing some claims that you are not 100% sure. You can't say legalizing same-sex marriage is against the will, okay, unless you do belong to that community. All right, so you have to adjust the assertiveness. And if you read the passage closely, you can actually see no I's or we's in the passage. Okay. Instead, the writer chose to start this sentence with this essay. Okay, as if the paper, his writing or her writing, is doing the research for him or her and showing the research results or the arguments to the readers. So this kind of sentence structure, this essay or this paper plus a research verb, is a very common expression in academic writing. Okay, in the first place, to hide the I, and at the same time highlight what the text will do instead. That means how you are approaching the topic. Again, you are foregrounding, you are emphasizing the topic of the essay instead of emphasizing you as the author of the essay. So last but not the least, these strategies seem to be a more advanced consideration or treatment when you are writing your paper. But let me point some of the key points or key phrases here in that you can consider or form some less overt opinions. For example, the adverb of concession, the adverb clause of concession would be a very useful tool. For example, if you want to say something negative as the main message, you might want to point out something positive first. And in this case, the writer said, although anti-discrimination initiatives should be promoted, so something positive first, this clause paves the way for the upcoming more negative main message. That is, legalizing same-sex marriage may be against the will of the more conservative communities in Hong Kong. And the second point, when the writer says the idea of legalizing same-sex marriage is against the will does not belong to the writer himself or herself. So instead of saying, I do not agree, he or she says instead, it is the will of the more conservative communities in Hong Kong, so they don't agree, not me. So I'm only thinking for them, okay? And then the third strategy would be arguments again. So if you remember the video that we made before, we tend to nominalize verbs. So the writer may have said, I am going to argue against something, or I'm going to suggest why this does not work. Instead, this writer chooses to say arguments against. And this replaces not agree in order to be less personal and more focused on reasoning. Because the word arguments does represent some kind of a reasoning process. So these are the strategies that you need to do as an advanced academic writer. Okay, so think about that. So to wrap up this episode, what we mean by impersonal would be relevant to objectivity. Okay, that we don't use I with thinking verbs, such as I think, I believe, I agree, or I disagree in academic writing. So this is the first thing you must remember. Second, you would also consider using modal verbs to adjust the degree of assertiveness. Okay? And modal verbs will be a part of the broader topic modality. So there are a few ways to adjust assertiveness using English. Okay? And the third point of being objective would be you have to incorporate different voices from the external sources, references to support your arguments. But in this case, you need to be clear whose voices are to be included in the text. Okay? So in all, objectivity or being impersonal would be, of course, using an impersonal, distant writing style. You vary the assertiveness of claims and use concrete and credible sources. Okay, so that's all from me. See you next time. Goodbye.